Hi, my name is Kim Trogal. I'm a senior lecturer in architecture, history and theory at the Canterbury School of Architecture. And my relationship to the Sheffield School of Architecture is that I studied both my BA and my MArch, so my Part 1 and Part 2 in architecture at the school. And I also studied my PhD with Doina Petrescu at the school. And as of this year, I'm also very fortunate to be invited to be visiting professor, which is a very great honour. so that's I should say as well, I studied my my Part 2 in kind of 2000 to 2002. So my connection to the school, I would say, is kind of quite long. So I guess in relation to kind of the first question, which asks how I perceive the feminist approach at Sheffield during the time that I was a student, and how that kind of informs my current practice. I think the feminist approach at Sheffield has been quite embedded for a very long time now, because even when I was there doing my MArch, I found it very present across all aspects of the school. And I think one of the ways that manifested itself was a pedagogy that declared its kind of situatedness. So you would have in studio, but also in lectures, kind of staff would really sort of say, well, this isn't necessarily the truth kind of, but I'm telling you something, and I'm kind of declaring kind of my position in relation to the things that we're talking about, and this is why it's important to me. And I think that as a student, we were all encouraged to kind of recognise our situatedness in the world, and also that being something that you should establish for yourself. It's not necessarily a given set of kind of criteria, but this being very much an ethical kind of question of how one locates oneself in the world. And I think the emphasis on feminist kind of approaches was also encouraged to see this as a political position and a practice that you would take on, that you would adopt. So I very much learned at Sheffield that it was not an essentialist position, that, you know, by virtue of kind of who you are, your gender or ethnicities, that would necessarily make you feminist, or that your practice would be feminist. This is something that one would have to actively choose. And I think that the approach at Sheffield during my education, particularly in studio practice, was really trying to draw attention to power relations in the built environment. So making that the kind of object of inquiry, but also within the power relationships within the classroom. So I remember a kind of, I don't really know how to say it, like a kind of a more self-reflexive kind of opportunity to collectively kind of question how we learn, and remaking those kind of social situations as a student, but with staff, of course, as well. It's not completely open, but this engagement with the real world is both kind of out in the city, but also the real kind of social relationships of the classroom. So I think, yeah, in my own case, I was also directly encouraged to engage with feminist theory, and to think about how that theory and what that tells you is operational in practice. And for me, that was very important. So yes, in your studio work, how do you perform the concepts that you're trying to engage with, but also in terms of being a student? So how you relate to others, how you self-organize, and what the kind of theoretical kind of underpinnings are of that. So I think that in terms of my current teaching, so I teach primarily undergraduate architecture and interior architecture students, and I think that a lot of what I learned at Sheffield comes into my collaborative kind of teaching practice. So this would be the first thing to say: I teach collaboratively. So when I applied for the job as lecturer at Canterbury School of Architecture, I did it as a job share with my friend and colleague, Dr. Anna Wakeford Holder. And the reason we did this was to try to collectivise what would otherwise be a very individual position, where you are somehow then, by the virtue of the labour market and such positions, you are put in competition with others, and put in competitions with people who are your friends. So how do we take something that's maybe the individual academic, and kind of collectivise that and make a team approach. I think one of the things I do remember about Sheffield as well is the kind of team approach to teaching, and we've definitely tried to kind of continue that in our own work. And one of the things that we do as well is to broaden the idea of the team beyond kind of academic staff, let's say, or subject specialist staff. And we work very closely with our academic librarian and our learning development tutor. So these are people who maybe would normally do kind of study skills for kind of students, but we kind of make them part of our team, and they have a say and shape how we teach. And for me, this is very important because we have a very diverse cohort of students, and potentially the risk of kind of existing social hierarchies that are in the world come into the classroom. And so how one kind of works to not just mitigate that, but to kind of to recognize things like cultural capital and things that are kind of already kind of playing out, and to kind of neutralize questions of privilege kind of already. So this collective kind of team approach, and kind of trying to engage with the kind of power relations is something that I try to do in my practice. I won't say that it's always successful or always working, but this is the ambition. And I think other aspects of the kind of feminist teaching from Sheffield that kind of come out in my work are, I think, very much the kind of critique of what Doina kind of coined as the social production of architecture. So looking at the built environment and looking at architecture in a relational kind of way. So understanding that these things are socially produced. It is not the outcome of a sole kind of authorship. And I think a lot of feminist scholarship really teaches a lot about this. So whether it's the role of clients or users, or a kind of, a much kind of broader and complex kind of understanding about how the built environment is kind of made. So we focus a lot on this, and particularly in our first year, kind of trying to diversify the kind of curriculum. So we try not to focus on the kind of white Western kind of European kind of history of architecture, but become a bit more kind of global. And and we're not completely there, but this I think would also kind of come from Sheffield in trying to recognise, the way that the built environment is socially produced, and having a much more critical approach to the kind of construction of history. What else? So that the next question is, what are your memories about feminist work at Sheffield School of Architecture? And if I remember a specific moment or aspect about this, there was one teaching moment that was during my MArch, during my part 2, which was, I was in the studio, and the studio is led by Doina Petrescu and with Aidan Hoggard. And I remember very clearly a teaching moment in which we were sat down as a big group. So I think there was about 20 of us, 20 students. And we were invited to each tell a bit about why we are actually in Sheffield, why we came to the course. And also to talk about, we were looking at kind of edge conditions in various kind of neighbourhoods, and we were asked to reflect on what this idea of an edge condition meant for us, and maybe from where we were from, or if we'd had experience of kind of borders and kind of urban edges, and what even that might mean as a concept. And it was a very powerful moment, because I think it was really the first time that I had heard the voices of certain students who, so this was my last year of the part 2, so I'd been at Sheffield for 5 years with the same, to a certain extent, with the same group of people. And it was the first time I ever heard from those people, actually why they were there and what conditions they'd maybe left, particularly international students, what conditions they'd maybe left behind, what it was they were looking for, and some of the situations that they had lived with in their home kind of countries. And it was fascinating to hear this, but also with a very good friend of mine afterwards, we were just discussing, why did we not have this conversation? We should have had this conversation in our first year. Like, why it was until the end that we finally heard like about these people, and for the first time got to know them and understand each other kind of better. And yeah, so we were very kind of grateful for this conversation, but also really critical that actually this should have been one of the first things that we had done to know. So I think this is also something that I learned from this experience, to really pay attention to who is in the room and why, and to listen to this and to try to understand on its own terms. So for me, that was a very important moment that I would say is a kind of feminist teaching moment. So the next question, which is, based on your experience, how would you define the current situation of architecture education and its relationship with feminism? Well, I think at the moment, in sort of beyond architecture, there's a much bigger kind of push again for a kind of feminist movement, feminist politics, which, and particularly from people who are quite a lot younger than myself, which I find very inspiring and very kind of interesting to learn from. So I find this really very encouraging, and I think within architecture education, I find this kind of wider kind of movement, I guess, visible again in schools of architecture, which I really appreciate. And I think what I also appreciate, or at least what I see, is that it's a movement that in which gender is one category of analysis, and where kind of change is being demanded and change is being created, but it's not, so kind of pushing for representation in all areas of architecture. But for me, this kind of feminist work is also helping to push or work with other kind of issues. So for example, the debates around kind of working conditions, advocating for better kind of working conditions for everybody, but kind of questions around labour. I think particularly questions around kind of race or ableism, kind of questions of sexuality, that it is really feels to me much more tied to kind of social kind of movements, and it's a feminism which is a kind of attuned to questions of social and spatial kind of justice. So that's how I see, for me at least, this connection. I mean, I think there's clearly still a kind of a lot to do, but I see this as being, very kind of a politically kind of engaged kind of moment. And I think the moment really demands it as well. So I feel very encouraged, with projects such as this as well that you are doing. And then a question also that was very challenging is, what does a future feminist school of architecture look like? And I think I can't remember who said it, if it was Jennifer Bloom or something, they said, well, a feminist architecture itself doesn't really look like anything, but how it's made and all the processes behind it will probably look very different. And I think the same is probably true of a school of architecture as well. So for me, this is a slight kind of manifesto kind of point, but I think a feminist school of architecture will be free at the point of participation. I think there would need to be some kind of progressive funding model that would enable that to be as inclusive as possible, irrespective of a person's background. I think that the curriculum of that school would have to be collectively established, and so the question of what's studied and how it's studied would need to be kind of open for debate and collectively shaped and open to reshaping. So there would need to be some very clever feminist design skills to enable such a process to happen. And how one deals with the differences and the conflicts of, how do we even, these are contentious issues, how we teach and what we teach. So it would need to be very carefully, designed. I think a future feminist school of architecture would be democratically owned, managed and run, and that it would involve, and that democratic management would involve all people of all kind of positions, if you're student, staff, and also the different types of staff and labour that are involved would need to, I everyone would need to have a voice, I think, in the way that the institution runs and manages itself and what those practices are. And I think for me personally, it would have to work against the marketization of education and all the things that kind of come with that, with the commodification of knowledge, the privatization of kind of knowledge. I think it would have to valorize a very different mode of kind of knowledge production, which amongst other things would not be fetishizing, let's say, the output of knowledge as this thing which is a kind of status, but it's much more about, well, fostering a kind of curiosity and engagement with the world at large, I would say. And I think it would need to support the development or the rediscovery of other forms of knowledge, potentially even marginalized forms of knowledge, and to make space for that to kind of grow and for that to kind of inform practice. And I think probably the list of what a feminist school of architecture will be is kind of quite long. So it would need to have the mechanisms to host these many desires and changing desires as more people add to the manifesto kind of list of what such a school would be.